The cage rattled before Grace even saw it. She had 6 coins in her pocket, meant for bread, and she was already late for her shift at the mill. The market street was crowded with carts and shouting traders, and she almost walked past the iron cage, sitting in the mud beside the meat stall. Almost. Something inside it moved. Grace stopped walking. The trader selling from the cage was a heavy man with a whip coiled at his belt, and he was calling out to the crowd like he was selling turnips. "Strong guard beast," he shouted. "Cheap. No papers needed. Bites on command." Grace looked closer, and her stomach turned over. It was not a beast. It was a boy, maybe her own age, folded into a space too small for him, wrists bound behind his back, a leather muzzle strapped tight across his face. His eyes were the only part of him that moved, and they moved fast, tracking every hand that came near the bars. Nobody else in the market looked twice. A muzzled boy sold as a dog was apparently nothing new in Ashwell. Grace had grown up poor enough to know what happens to things nobody looks twice at. They disappear, quietly, permanently. She stepped up to the cage before she had decided to. "How much?" she asked. The trader grinned, showing a gap where 2 teeth should have been. "5 coins, girl. Cheap as I said. He barks, he bites, he'll guard your door better than any lock." Grace did not have 5 coins to spare. She had 6, and 4 of those were owed to her landlord by sundown. She thought of her empty cupboard. She thought of the boy's eyes, which had stopped tracking the trader and were now fixed on her, waiting, the way a man waits for a verdict. She put 5 coins in the trader's hand. The cage door groaned open and the boy did not move. He stared at her like the open door was a trick, like stepping toward it would cost him something worse than staying inside. Grace crouched down so she was level with him, close enough now to see the raw skin under the muzzle straps, the bruises circling both wrists. "Come on," she said quietly. "It's not far." He came out on his hands, not his feet, like an animal that had forgotten it once had a different way of moving. Grace did not touch him. She had learned that much just from watching his eyes. She walked slowly, and he followed a few paces behind her, all the way through the market, past the fish stalls and the cloth sellers and a group of children who stopped their game to stare. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked questions. That was the strange thing about buying a person as a dog. Nobody thought it was worth a question at all. Her house was one room at the edge of the Omega Quarter, with a single window and a door that did not lock properly. She had a chair, a stove that worked half the time, and a mattress stuffed with straw. It was not much. It was more than the cage. She left the door open behind him, so he would know he was free to leave, and then she sat down at her small table and ate half a boiled potato, because it was all she had left after paying the landlord. She did not remove the muzzle. She wanted to. Every part of her wanted to reach across and unbuckle the straps digging into his cheeks. But she had seen how he flinched when the trader raised a hand, how his whole body braced for a blow that never landed on her account. She understood, without anyone explaining it to her, that trust was not something you could hand a person along with 5 coins. It had to be earned in smaller currency, one quiet evening at a time. She slid the other half of her potato across the floor toward him. He did not touch it. He sat in the corner farthest from the door, knees pulled to his chest, and watched the potato like it might be a trap too. Grace banked the stove fire low, wrapped herself in her one blanket, and lay down on the mattress with her back to him, because turning her back felt like the only gift she had left to give that night. It said, plainly, "I am not afraid of you." It said, "I am not watching you like they did." She did not sleep well. She heard him shift once in the night, the scrape of the muzzle against the floorboards, and then nothing. In the morning the potato was gone. She did not say anything about it. She simply set out a heel of bread before she left for the mill, and told him, in a voice she hoped was steady, that she would be back before dark, and that the door had a bad latch but he was welcome to use it either way, in or out. He said nothing back. He never made a sound at all, not even through the muzzle. Grace wondered, walking to the mill with her hands jammed in her pockets against the cold, whether the leather over his mouth was even necessary anymore, or whether the silence underneath it, belonged to him now, permanently, a habit grown into bone. She came home to find the bread gone and the boy exactly where she had left him. This went on for 4 days. On the 5th day, she came home earlier than usual, her shift cut short because the mill owner's daughter was getting married and the whole town was closing up shop, and she found the boy standing at her window, upright for the first time since she had brought him home, looking out at the street with something in his eyes that was not fear. It looked for just a moment like longing. He dropped back down the second he heard her at the door, folding himself small again, and Grace felt something crack quietly in her chest at how fast the transformation happened, how practiced it was, how a boy could learn to make himself smaller than he actually was, just to survive being looked at. That night she sat across from him with her evening meal, a thin soup she had stretched with an extra measure of water so there would be enough for 2 bowls, and instead of sliding his portion across the floor, she held it out toward him, arm extended, and waited. He looked at the bowl, he looked at her, he looked at the door, calculating the distance, the way you would in a room you did not trust. Then, slow enough that she could have counted his heartbeat in the movement, he crawled forward and took the bowl from her hands. His fingers brushed hers for less than a second. Grace did not flinch, and neither, after a moment of visible surprise, did he. She still did not remove the muzzle that night, but she understood, watching him carry the bowl back to his corner and tip the soup carefully through the gap at the side of the leather straps, drinking like a man who had learned to survive on scraps and angles and whatever small mercy the world allowed him, that something had shifted. Not everything, not yet, but something. 5 coins, she thought, looking at him in the low firelight. 5 coins for a person nobody else in that market had thought worth a second glance. She wondered, not for the first time, what he had been before someone decided he was worth exactly that much and not 1 coin more. She did not ask. She simply banked the fire, turned her back to him again, and went to sleep, and in the morning, for the first time, the boy was sitting by the door when she woke, not cowering in the corner, but sitting upright, watching the thin light come through the window, like it was something he had almost forgotten was allowed to reach him. Grace smiled at him before she could stop herself. He did not smile back, but he did not look away either, and for a boy who had spent 5 days flinching from every hand and every shadow, that alone felt like the beginning of something Grace did not yet have a name for. 3 weeks passed before Grace learned his silence was not the silence of a broken mind, but the silence of a man doing sums in his head, constantly, calculating every risk in the room before he allowed himself to breathe easy. She had started calling him Pup, half as a joke and half because she needed something to call him that was gentler than the words the trader had used. He never objected. He never offered anything else. Whatever name he had been born with, he kept it locked somewhere behind the muzzle, along with everything else about himself that he had decided was not safe to give away yet. The muzzle came off on a Tuesday. Grace remembered it was a Tuesday because it was mill payday, and she had come home with a small sack of flour and a strip of dried meat, more food in one evening than she usually managed in a week. She set half of it in front of him without ceremony, the way she always did now, and turned to bank the stove. When she turned back, he was eating. Not through the gap at the side of the muzzle, the careful sideways sipping she had grown used to watching. He had loosened the buckle himself, working it free with fingers that shook the whole time, and he was eating with the muzzle hanging open around his jaw like a broken hinge, watching her the entire time for the moment she would take it away from him. Grace kept her hands very still in her lap. "Good," she said quietly. "Keep eating." He ate like a man who expected the food to vanish if he looked away from it too long. When he finished, he did not put the muzzle back on. He simply sat there, breathing through an open mouth for what was probably the first time in longer than Grace wanted to think about, and looked at her with an expression she could not read at all. That was fine. She was in no hurry to be understood by him either. "Are you hurting?" she asked, nodding at the raw lines the leather had worn into his cheeks. He did not answer with words. He touched 2 fingers to the marks, briefly, The way you touch a bruise to check it is still there, and then let his hand fall. That was the first time Grace heard his voice, if you could call it that. A low sound, barely more than breath, that might have been the beginning of a word before he swallowed it back down. She did not push. Whatever he had been before the cage, he was learning to be a person again, one small motion at a time, and Grace had decided, somewhere in that first week, that her job was not to rush him toward whoever he used to be. Her job was simply to leave the door unlatched and the bowl within reach, and let him arrive at himself in his own time. The strange things started not long after. She noticed it first with the shelf. A rotten board gave way one evening, sending a stack of pots crashing toward the floor, and before Grace had even registered the noise, Pup had crossed the room and caught the falling shelf clean out of the air, one arm braced against the wall to take the weight. It should not have been possible. He was thin as a fence post from weeks of poor feeding. But the movement itself was wrong in a different way than his strength was wrong. It was too clean, too trained, not the panicked lunge of a frightened stray, but the precise economical motion of someone who had drilled that exact kind of reaction into his body 1,000 times over, long before any of this happened to him. Grace filed that away and said nothing. She noticed it again with the door hinge, which had squeaked since before she moved in, and which she had never had the coin to fix properly. She came home one day to find it silent, and Pup sitting nearby with a bent nail in one hand, having worked out on his own, with no tools and no teacher, exactly how much force a hinge needed and at what angle, like a man who understood leverage the way other men understood breathing. A stray dog did not know things like that. A guard beast, bred and beaten into obedience from birth, did not know things like that. Grace started listening more carefully to the small sounds he made when he thought she was asleep. Not words yet, but the shapes of words, forming and dissolving in his throat, practiced in the dark, like a man relearning a language he used to speak fluently. One night, weeks into this quiet arrangement, a neighbor named Peter came pounding on her door, drunk and loud, demanding she pay him back for a debt that was not hers, raising his hand toward her in a way that made every muscle in her body go cold with old, familiar dread. Pup moved before Grace had finished flinching. He was between her and Peter in less time than it took her to draw breath, and the sound that came out of him then was not the whimper of a beaten stray. It was low and controlled and utterly certain, a warning delivered with the calm of someone who had given that exact warning before and had never once needed to repeat it. Peter left without his money. Grace stood very still afterward, staring at Pup's back, at the rigid line of his shoulders slowly loosening now that the danger had passed, and she understood, with a clarity that unsettled her more than it comforted her, that whatever this boy had been before the cage, he had not spent his life cowering. He had spent it protecting someone. She thought about asking him right then who that someone had been. Instead, she said only, "Are you all right?" And he nodded once, and the moment passed, folded quietly back into the ordinary rhythm of their evening, the way most of their moments did, because Grace had learned that pressing him for answers only made the muzzle come back on, invisible now but no less real. Weeks folded into a month, and then most of a second one. Pup began speaking in fragments, short and oddly formal, words a street boy would never reach for on instinct. He called the stove a hearth. He called the market a bazaar of fools, once, so dryly that Grace laughed out loud before she caught herself, and he looked briefly, startlingly pleased with himself, before the expression closed back over like a door shutting. He began fixing things around the house with a competence that had nothing to do with luck. A cracked table leg, reinforced with a joint so clean it looked like it had come from a carpenter's shop rather than a man with no tools and no training that Grace had ever seen him receive. A leaking roof patch that held through the next 3 storms without complaint. Her neighbors noticed too, and their noticing came with a different flavor than Grace's did. "There goes the Omega with the beast," she overheard one evening, from 2 women gossiping over a fence. "Wonder when it turns on her." Grace did not dignify it with a response. She had learned, over years of being poor and unmarried, and alone in a town that did not think much of women who lived that way, that explaining herself to people who had already decided their opinion rarely changed anything except her own peace of mind. She went home instead, and found Pup sitting by the window in the last of the daylight, and she told him, unprompted, what the women had said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in that low, careful voice that was slowly gaining more words each week, "Let them wonder." It was the longest sentence she had heard him speak. Grace smiled, and this time he almost smiled back, the corner of his mouth twitching upward before some old habit of caution smoothed it flat again. That was the night she stopped calling him Pup out loud, though she kept it in her head as something private and fond, and started asking, gently, whether he had a name he wanted to be called instead. He looked at her for a long time before he answered. "Not yet," he said. Grace did not push, she simply nodded, and let the question sit between them unresolved, the way she had learned to let most things about him sit unresolved, trusting that whatever he was protecting by staying silent, he had good reason to protect it, and that her trust mattered more right now than her curiosity. She did not know yet how right she was to trust that instinct, or how much would depend, in the months to come, on the fact that she had never once demanded he explain himself before he was ready. By the second month, Grace had stopped pretending, even to herself, that the boy she had bought for 5 coins was anything close to what the trader had claimed. He spoke almost normally now, though sparingly, choosing each word like it cost him something to spend. He still would not give her his name. He still flinched on rare occasions at sounds that seemed to mean nothing at all to anyone else. A particular rhythm of footsteps outside, the jangle of a specific kind of chain sold at the tanner's stall, a raised voice giving an order rather than a request. Grace had stopped asking why. She had started, instead, simply noticing and adjusting the small rhythms of their shared life so those sounds came less often. She began calling him by a name of her own choosing, since he refused to offer one. She settled on Gray, for the color of his eyes in the low evening light, and he accepted it without argument, though something in his face suggested it was not the name he was used to answering to. It was on an ordinary evening, thick with the smell of rain that had not yet fallen, that the fixing became something more than useful. Grace had brought home a broken lock, salvaged from a neighbor who was throwing it out, thinking Gray might enjoy the puzzle of it the way he seemed to enjoy any small mechanical problem she set in front of him. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment, and then, without any visible effort, took it apart into its component pieces, laid them out in a precise row on the table, and began explaining to her, in a voice growing steadily more confident, exactly how the mechanism worked, why this particular design was flawed, and how a better one would be built instead. He used words Grace had never heard a common laborer use: tension plate, ward configuration, load-bearing pin. She sat very still and listened, and when he finished, she asked him, as gently as she knew how, where he had learned to speak about locks like that. He went quiet in a way that was different from his usual silence. This was not the silence of a man calculating risk. This was the silence of a man standing at the edge of a memory he was not sure he could survive stepping into. "I do not know," he said finally. "I only know that I know it." Grace understood, in that moment, that whatever had been done to him before the cage, it had not simply beaten him into submission. It had tried to erase him, and had not quite succeeded, leaving behind a man who carried the shape of an education, a discipline, a whole former life, without the memory of how any of it had been earned. She did not push further that night. She simply reached across the table and rested her hand briefly over his, and he let her, though his fingers trembled under her palm like a man unused to being touched with anything other than intent to hurt him. The following weeks brought smaller revelations, each one a fragment rather than a full picture. He flinched, badly, at the sight of a particular crest stitched into a merchant's banner one market day, a golden wolf circling a crown, and would not say why, though his hands did not stop shaking for the rest of that afternoon. He recognized, without being told, the proper way to address a nobleman's letter, correcting Grace's careful but clumsy attempt to write a request to the mill owner with an instinctive certainty that surprised them both. He knew, somehow, the layout of the old palace grounds on the hill above Ashwell, describing hallways and gardens he claimed he had never seen with a precision that made Grace's skin prickle. She began to suspect, quietly, that the man sitting across her table every evening was not simply a stray who had learned trades by accident. She began to suspect he had once belonged to a world entirely different from the one poverty had confined her to her whole life. She did not say this out loud. Whatever he was hiding, she reasoned, he was hiding it because the truth was dangerous, not because he wanted to deceive her, and Grace had decided long ago that a person's right to their own secrets did not expire simply because someone else grew curious. She kept feeding him. She kept teaching him small things about the ordinary world he seemed to have forgotten: how to haggle at the market, how to laugh at a joke without apologizing for it afterward, how to sit in a chair without positioning himself for a fast exit. He, in turn, began teaching her things she had never had access to before. How to read a contract for hidden traps in its wording, how to tell, by the stitching on a merchant's coat, roughly how much coin that merchant actually had, regardless of what he claimed, how to stand in a room so that you were never quite where a threat expected you to be. Grace found herself, one evening, laughing freely at something he said, a dry observation about their neighbor Edith's terrible taste in husbands, and looked up to find him watching her laugh with an expression of such quiet, unguarded fondness that her own breath caught in her throat. He looked away first, as he always did, but not before she saw it. It was 3 days after that evening when the flinching happened at its worst. A traveling merchant had come through Ashwell selling trinkets, among them a collar, decorative, meant for a lady's small dog, gold thread worked through supple leather. Grace saw it from across the market and went so still that Grace thought, for one terrifying second, that he had stopped breathing entirely. She got him home somehow, though neither of them spoke a word the whole way back, and once the door was shut behind them, he sat down hard on the floor, back against the wall, and put both hands over his face, and made a sound Grace had never heard from him before, low and broken, the sound of a dam giving way after holding back a flood for far too long. "I was thrown back," he said, muffled behind his hands. "Years, all at once. I do not know how many years. I only know it was not now." Grace did not ask him to explain further. She sat down on the floor beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, but not so close as to crowd him, and she waited. After a long while, his breathing steadied, and something colder and more familiar replaced the raw grief in his face. Anger, she realized, watching the shift happen in real time. Not rage, something quieter and more practiced than rage, a tool he reached for because it was steadier ground than fear. He straightened his spine, he lowered his hands. Whatever had cracked open in him a moment ago sealed itself back over, not healed, simply hidden again, the way a wound gets covered rather than treated. "I am sorry," he said, in a voice gone flat and controlled again. "That should not have happened in front of you." Grace did not tell him it was fine. It was not fine, and she was not going to insult whatever he had just survived by pretending otherwise. Instead, she said only, "You do not have to apologize to me for surviving something." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes, and then he nodded, once, and the subject closed, unresolved, the way most things about his past remained unresolved between them, waiting for a day neither of them could yet predict. That night, for the first time since she had brought him home, he did not retreat to his corner of the room. He sat near her instead, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and neither of them said anything else about the collar, or the years he had lost, or the crown and wolf crest that made his hands shake. Grace fell asleep to the unfamiliar comfort of not being alone in the dark, and did not yet understand how soon that comfort would be tested by the arrival of everything he had spent 3 months trying not to remember. The knock came on an ordinary morning, which was somehow the worst part of it. Grace was mending a torn hem by the window when she heard the sound of wheels on the street outside, more of them than usual, and heavier, the kind of carriages that did not belong anywhere near the Omega Quarter. She set down her needle and looked out, and her stomach dropped straight through the floor. Soldiers filled the narrow street from end to end, not the town watch, whose uniforms she knew by sight. These wore deep blue and gold, the colors of the Royal Guard, colors she had only ever seen on tapestries and coins, never in her own doorway. Her first thought was that they had come for her, some debt, some old infraction, some clerical mistake that would end with her, dragged before a magistrate she had never met. Her second thought, sharper and colder than the first, was Gray. She turned to look at him and found him already standing, already utterly rigid, staring at the door, with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 3 months of watching him carefully. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to a man watching a debt come due that he had spent every day hoping might somehow be forgiven. "Gray," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. He did not answer. He was looking at the door the way a man looks at a verdict he already knows. The knock, when it came, was almost gentle, which made it worse. A single measured sound, followed by silence, followed by the door opening without her ever crossing the room to unlatch it, because someone outside had simply decided that permission was not required. The man who stepped through first was not a soldier. He wore no armor, only fine dark robes edged in gold thread, and he dropped to one knee the moment he crossed the threshold, eyes fixed not on Grace but on Gray, and his voice, when he spoke, trembled with something that sounded very much like relief held too long. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have searched 3 months for you." The words did not make sense to Grace at first. She heard them the way you hear a sentence in a language you almost speak, catching the shape of it without the meaning arriving properly. Gray did not move. His jaw was tight, his hands closed into fists at his sides, and when he finally spoke, his voice held none of the quiet warmth Grace had grown used to hearing across her small table. It was flat and controlled, a voice built for command rather than conversation. "Rise, Aldrich," he said, "and close that door before half the street sees you kneeling in a laborer's home." The man called Aldrich rose, and more soldiers filed in behind him, filling the tiny room until Grace felt the walls pressing closer than they ever had before. She stood frozen by the window, hymn still half-mended in her hand, trying and failing to reconcile the careful, wounded man she had fed potato soup to for 3 months, with whatever title the kneeling man had just used. "Your Majesty," she repeated, very quietly, to no one in particular. Gray turned to look at her then, and for the first time since the soldiers arrived, something softened in his face, though it did not erase the tension underneath. "I did not lie to you," he said. "I simply did not know how to tell you the truth without losing everything I had managed to build in this house." Grace found her voice, though it shook. "Who are you?" "King Alaric Weimar," Aldrich answered before Gray could, "sole ruler of the kingdom whose borders your little town sits inside." Presumed dead these 3 months past, following a coup led by his own cousin, who drugged him during a state banquet and had him sold into bondage to be quietly disposed of before anyone thought to look closely at a stray in a marketplace. Grace's knees went weak enough that she had to grip the windowsill. 3 months. The same 3 months she had spent teaching him to laugh, to sit without flinching, to eat without fear that the food would vanish. The entire time, unknowingly, she had been sheltering a king that half his own kingdom believed was dead. Gray, or Alaric, or whatever she was supposed to call him now, crossed the room to stand in front of her, ignoring the soldiers, ignoring Aldrich, ignoring the enormous weight of everything that had just been revealed, and looked at her the way he had looked at her that very first night, when she slid half a potato across the floor and waited without demanding anything in return. "You bought a broken thing for 5 coins, he said quietly, when nobody else would even look at him twice. "I do not know how to repay a debt that size. I am not certain it can be repaid at all." Grace did not have an answer ready. She had spent 3 months learning how to live with a silent, wounded stranger, not preparing herself for the sudden, dizzying reality of a king standing in her one-room house with an entire royal guard crowded in behind him, waiting to see what she would say. Aldrich cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable at the delay. "Your Majesty, the court must be informed at once. There are arrangements to make, a coronation to reclaim, a cousin to answer for his crimes. Every hour we remain here is an hour of risk." Alaric did not look away from Grace. "Give us the room," he said. The soldiers hesitated only a moment before filing back out into the street, Aldrich following last, throwing one uncertain glance back at Grace before the door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone with a man she had thought she knew completely and now understood she barely knew at all. The silence stretched long enough that Grace finally found the courage to break it herself. "Is any of it real?" she asked. "Any of what happened here? Or was I simply useful to you until your own people found you again?" Something flickered across Alaric's face that looked almost like pain at the question. "Every evening at this table was real," he said. "Every bowl of soup you never had to share, and shared with me anyway. Every hour you spent teaching me how to be a person again, instead of a thing to be pitied or feared. None of that was a performance, Grace. If anything, it is the only part of the last 3 months I trust completely." Grace studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the practiced calm of a ruler managing an inconvenient loose end, and found instead the same tired, guarded honesty she had come to recognize over 3 months of shared silences. "What happens now?" she asked. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Now," he said, "I go back to a court full of people who will want you gone the moment they learn what happened here. A poor Omega who bought a king for 5 coins and knows exactly how broken he was when she did it. I am not naive about what that means for you." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest, a fear that had nothing to do with soldiers or crowns and everything to do with the simple, brutal fact that powerful men rarely let inconvenient truths keep breathing. "Are you telling me I am in danger?" she asked. "I am telling you," he said, "that I intend to make certain you are not, whatever that costs me." He did not elaborate further that day. The soldiers returned within the hour, and Alaric left with them, back straight, voice once again flat and commanding, every trace of the quiet man who ate potato soup on her floor folded carefully back beneath the armor of his true title. Grace stood in her doorway long after the carriages had gone, staring at the empty street, wondering whether she had just watched the only honest relationship of her life disappear into a world that had no place left in it for someone like her. She did not know yet that the story was far from finished, or that the very qualities that had made her buy a broken stranger for 5 coins were about to matter more than any crown in the kingdom. 3 days passed with no word from the palace, and Grace spent every one of them convinced she would never see him again. She went back to the mill because the rent did not care that a king had once eaten her potato soup, and she came home each evening to a house that felt larger and emptier than it ever had before Gray arrived, and smaller and more silent than it had any right to feel now that she knew his true name. On the 4th day, a single rider came instead of an army, dressed in plain traveling clothes with no crest visible anywhere, and delivered a folded letter sealed simply with wax and no royal stamp at all. Grace read it twice before the words settled properly. It asked, in careful, formal handwriting that did not match the clipped speech she remembered, whether she would receive a visitor that evening, without guards, without ceremony, as a private citizen rather than a king. She said yes before she had fully decided to. He arrived alone at dusk, on foot, wearing clothes so plain that if she had passed him on the street she might not have looked twice, which she suspected was entirely the point. He stood in her doorway the same way he had stood there the very first night, uncertain of his welcome, waiting to see whether the door would stay open for him. Grace stepped aside to let him in, the way she always had. They sat across the same small table, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised them both after everything that had changed between them. "The court wanted you removed," Alaric said finally, quietly, permanently. "Aldrich argued for it for 2 days straight, insisting a poor Omega, who knew the truth of my captivity, was too great a liability to leave breathing. Grace's hands went very still on the table. "And what did you say?" "I told them," he said, "that the only person in this entire kingdom who never once asked me for anything, who never used my weakness against me, who fed me and taught me how to be a man again instead of a thing, was the last person in Weimar I intended to sacrifice for the comfort of frightened courtiers." Grace looked at him for a long moment, searching for the trick in it, the way she had learned to search for tricks in everything since poverty taught her that kindness rarely came free. She found none. "I am not offering you a title," he continued, before she could ask. "I am not offering you a palace, or wealth you have no interest in, or a life you never asked for. I am asking you the same question you never got to ask me, that first night in the market, when you chose to buy a broken thing nobody else thought was worth 5 coins. He reached across the small table, palm open, the way she had once slid a bowl toward him, and waited to see if he would take it. "Will you keep me?" he asked quietly. "Not as a king, as whatever it is I actually am to you." Grace looked at his open hand for a long moment, remembering the muzzle, the raw marks it had left, the months of silence, the fixed hinges, and the loosened locks, and the low, careful laughter that had taken so long to earn. She thought about the danger his crown would always carry into her small, quiet life, the court that wanted her gone, the cousin still out there somewhere answering for his crimes, the entire complicated machinery of a kingdom that had no obvious place in it for a poor Omega from the mill. She thought, too, about the first night she had sat across from a silent, terrified stranger and slid half a potato toward him, expecting nothing at all in return, simply because leaving him behind had felt like a cruelty she could not live with. She put her hand in his. "The muzzle is really gone," she said. "For good." "For good," he agreed. Outside, Ashwell settled into its ordinary evening sounds. Carts creaking home, dogs barking at nothing, neighbors gossiping over fences about things that would seem impossibly small once the truth of that quiet house finally came out. Inside, a king who had once been sold for 5 coins sat across a small wooden table from the only person who had ever seen him as something other than a price, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because for the first time in 3 months, nothing else needed to be said at all.